Now, Dr. Ian Mitchell is joining us, and he is an ER doctor that has quite an extensive background into research, dealing with opioids. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about this whole establishment of DUI, driving under the influence of possibly cannabis. First of all, give me a background of you and how you got started in the industry.
Well, I'm an emergency doctor up in Kamloops, and that's kind of my main occupation, but I'm involved in the cannabis world as a provider for cannabis for patients at a cannabis clinic up there that I run with MCRCI. And I'm also involved in research as far as doing a study that's run out of UBC and sponsored by Tilray on PTSD and cannabis. So that's a bit of kind of the background.
Yeah.
The driving kind of comes in as far as intersection of these two worlds of emergency medicine and cannabis.
Of course.
Our hospital is one of the major trauma hospitals in British Columbia. So we see lots of trauma, and certainly we see lots of trauma associated with alcohol.
Okay.
But now the concern is really coming up with cannabis. You know, what's going to happen once it's made recreationally legal?
Right.
And what's happening just as cannabis use is increasing in our society in general.
Yeah. So you see a lot of trauma where you are associated with in Kamloops. Let's talk a little bit about that whole gray area. There's a lot of talk about cannabis and driving. Is it known? I mean, there's a lot of alcohol, but what's going on there?
So we know that alcohol is out there, and we have a very good idea of what alcohol does to people. The more alcohol you take in your body, the more impaired you are, and it's very simple. And that's why we can rely on breathalyzer tests to say, well, look, if you've got this amount of alcohol, you are too impaired to drive. And we tolerate a lower level of impairment, but we draw the line at 0.05 or 0.08, depending where you are in Canada, and saying, look, that's it. We don't allow impairment beyond that area. The problem with cannabis is it's not so straightforward. We don't have the science to say that a blood level correlates with impairment. In fact, we have very good scientific evidence that it does not correlate with impairment.
Right. Okay, let's get into that scientific evidence of it not correlating, because it's a fascinating one for me. I think I was reading some of the statistics in one of the articles that you published where alcohol can lead to a 200% rate of possible accident, whereas cannabis is a different percentage that's much, much lower. Yeah,
so this is everybody's worried that it's going to be carnage on the roads and it'll be just complete disaster.
Scare tactic?
It is very much a scare tactic. So a recent study out of France looked at the issue of driving with alcohol compared to cannabis.
Okay.
And what they found was that there was a 65% increase in the risk of accident with cannabis. And that sounds pretty bad, but we're talking about really small risks to begin with. You know, when you go out, your risk of being in an accident is 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000. But even though that sounds bad, the comparison with alcohol, the increased risk was 1,600%.
Oh my gosh, so comparable.
So your increased risk is 1.6 with cannabis, but 17. So it actually is 25 times worse as far as impairing than cannabis.
So with the research levels, I mean, we're not quite there. I mean, we just heard about a study from France. Are we moving forward with increased research in this space? Because a lot of people back home, as you said, they are scared of it. It's going to wreak havoc on the roads. Where are we in Canada?
We're actually awaiting the results of a new study coming out that's being carried out through Vancouver General. Dr. Brubaker has done a lot of work in this area.
Okay. And
our hospital has been participating in this research. And what it's about is looking at accidents and if people are culpable. You know, if someone drives a truck into you, that's not your fault. It doesn't matter what substances you're in.
Right.
But if you go off the road on an empty road, that's probably your fault. So those are the accidents where we're really interested in what role did the substances play there. So that's research that's coming out. But what we can say right now is that overall, even at worst, cannabis rarely gives people a higher level of intoxication than people with a 0.05 blood alcohol level.
Wow, really?
So we're just not talking that same level of impairment.
Right.
You just don't get up to that. Now, I'm not saying that can't happen, and there's people, maybe they ate 4 brownies, they probably shouldn't be on the road, and that's pretty sensible.
But the typical consumer, the typical recreational consumer or medicinal consumer can pretty much understand that if they smoke a cannabis, for instance, or maybe ingest some of it, they're not going to get to the level of impairment that alcohol is. And that's typically what people are thinking is going to happen.
So that doesn't mean it's okay and off you should go and drive on the road after taking a couple of puffs, but pot consumers are much more able to gauge their impairment. They do tend to drive slower.
Okay.
And they kind of are able to gauge their own impairment, whereas for alcohol it tends to be the reverse, that people don't have judgment about their driving and they tend to drive more erratically.
So we've covered a little bit of the research and where we are in a Canadian market of that. Have you seen any type of product or technology out there that may be able to provide a road test for police officers? I mean, a lot of the police departments out there are launching this anti-campaign, right? We're hearing about it all in the States, especially too. Where are we with that? Are we there?
Well, we're not, and right now they're still looking at breathalyzer technology, and this is going to fail miserably. It's never going to stand up to any court scrutiny, because what we know very clearly is that the level of THC in your blood doesn't correlate with impairment. So you're never going to be able to square that with the courts, and it unfairly penalizes people who might be chronic medical users and will always have a blood level that would preclude them from driving. So really we need to move into tests that don't test for blood levels, but test for impairment. And that's really the critical difference. So that's what the drug recognition experts do when they get out and have people walk the line and touch their nose, that kind of thing.
Sobriety tests.
But that's super expensive and intensive, and there's not that many experts around. So we need to move to that next level with technology, to find an app, to find, there's a university in America that's looking at some kind of helmet device that would read your brain waves and measure impairment. But we need to move beyond blood levels.
So say if you had, and this is a hypothetical one, I'm just going to throw it at you. Say if you had a child out there, or not a child because they would be of age, obviously, maybe, let's hypothetically say somebody over 25 years old, and they were a loved one of yours, would you advise against driving under the influence of of cannabis?
Yeah, I think you have to give that information as the main recommendation. Generally for study purposes, we recommend that people don't drive for at least 3 hours after consuming, particularly if they're feeling high. Now, that's the same information I would give to somebody if I was starting them on morphine for a pain condition. But I wouldn't expect that a week or 2 weeks down the line that they would still not drive. If they're still taking morphine, we would expect they'd get used to it, they would be able to gauge the effect, and they would adjust their driving accordingly. And that's what people need to do with cannabis as well. You have to take responsibility, but also appreciate that it's nowhere near as impairing as alcohol. And so that people shouldn't be that concerned that it's going to be a disaster on the streets.
So in terms of driving under the influence of cannabis, where do you think we're going to be in the next, let's say, a year with legalization coming up in July?
So I think we're going to be moving away from breathalyzers. I hope that we'll have passed that point and moving on to better technology. There's an app called Druid, which people can download on their cell phone or their iPhone.
You were talking about that before. It's almost like a field sobriety test in an app.
It's a field sobriety test in an app. Basically, it gets you to do some balancing tests and move the device around. And based on that, it can't tell you that you're safe to drive, but it can tell you that you're unsafe to drive. And so even that is going to be helpful for people, and that's applicable for alcohol and cannabis.
So the message of the story is alcohol and cannabis while driving is very much different, and we shouldn't do either, but we shouldn't also be that scared of all of this, this rhetoric that we're hearing. Doctor, thank you for your time today.
My pleasure.